Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being in our class today. I wanted us to start right on time today because the great struggle for me in this series, the story, is there is so much information. I'm having a hard time even compressing down the parts of the information that I'd like to present. Appreciate your continued interest in our class, your continued interest in studying the Word of God. Chapter 13 in the story is where we find ourselves this morning. If you have your textbook, I would encourage you to be turning there, chapter 13. And the book of 1 Kings will serve as our primary text in your Bibles this morning, the book of 1 Kings. I will tell you that as I was looking at the life of Solomon and thinking about what you could do in one Sunday school class time, I thought as a general contractor how I could spend 4 or 5 weeks talking about Solomon's construction projects, both the temple and his own personal palace. And I decided I probably personally better not go there. I could talk for a week or two about his interaction and visit with the Queen of Sheba, and decided as well that that's probably not where I needed to get bogged down. So I want to encourage you in your own personal study and your own personal readings to visit both of those, and I think you will find them extremely fascinating. I think for the purposes of our class today, in my mind, I felt like I needed to talk about how Solomon started and how he ended, both how he began and how he finished, and that will be our focus today. And so as you look at your text, if you are in the book of 1 Kings, to set the stage, David has now passed, and Solomon, his son, by Bathsheba, has now ascended the throne. And Solomon has been given very important and very specific instructions from his father David. Instructions about how he should lead, instructions about being wise, about being strong. David even talks to him specifically about being a man. The kingdom, the text says, has now been firmly established. And there is no doubt that Solomon now has complete control over Israel. And so if you're in your text in 1 Kings, we read just now the first verse of chapter 3. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Marriage to fellow royalty was a common political strategy in the ancient world, and it continues to be a political strategy in certain parts of our world even today. It was not only that royalty at times wanted to marry other royalty, but it was a political move because conflict between nations could often be avoided for the sake of family ties. Now, I'd like to point out that this was not Solomon's first marriage. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 21 tells us that when his son Rehoboam came to the throne, he was 41 years old. 1 Kings 11:42 tells us that Solomon reigned 40 years. And even if you're not a very good math student, and I wasn't, by the way, I think I could figure this out. That means that Rehoboam was born to his mother, a wife of Solomon named NEHEMIAH, the Ammonite, before he came to the throne and before he married the daughter of Pharaoh. So as we talk about beginnings, as we talk about discussing how he started and how he finished, let me just go ahead and tell you that Solomon's multiple marriages to foreign women will absolutely cause great disaster in his life. Later in the book of Nehemiah was very angry and he was very frustrated with the people of God, with the people of Israel, because they had intermarried with pagan nations all around them in direct violation of the commandment that God had given them. And in rebuking those guilty parties, Nehemiah recalls, he remembers for them Solomon's bad example. And he says, as he writes to them, that Solomon sinned against God by doing this. And your reference just here is Nehemiah chapter 13, specifically verses 25 through 27. The foreign wives made Solomon more than just a bad example. They ruined his spiritual life. 700 wives. Men, just think about that for a moment, all right? Just sort of let that soak in. 700 wives, 300 concubines. What in the world could possibly go wrong with that, right? And they turned away his heart unto other gods. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. So Solomon marries the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And even though this was permitted under the law of Moses, it was not wise, nor was it good for Solomon to do so. Later in his life, he will come to deeply regret this decision. Go back to the text now and let's look at verses 2, 3, and 4. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At this time in Israel's story, altars were allowed at various high places, as they were called in Israel. And in what you are now reading, I think we read a bit of an assessment, both good and bad, of Solomon. There is good in that generally he walked in the ways, in the statutes of his father David. The bad, I think, can be identified by the word except. Now, it seems that God showed mercy to those who violated his commands, his precepts, before the temple was built. And you can read in numerous places in the Old Testament about prophets and judges and kings who preceded Solomon and who also sacrificed on the high places. Once the temple was built, it was sinful for them to offer those sacrifices in any other place. I think Solomon did love the Lord, and I would not presume to tell you in any way that he did not. But I would also tell you that he loved his women, and he loved those foreign wives who eventually would turn his heart away from God. We also just read that Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the particular altar that is described here. And if you've read even a little bit about the process of sacrifices, the process of burnt offerings, I read that and to me it just sounds almost grotesque, the sheer amount of sacrifices being offered here. I can't, in my mind, even imagine what that scene must have looked like. But I decided to think about it this way. The amount of sacrifice demonstrates both Solomon's great wealth and his heart to use it to God's glory, at least at this point in his life. If you go to the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 1, specifically verses 2 and 3, this was the ceremonial beginning of Solomon's reign. And the entire leadership of the nation went with Solomon to Gibeon. So Solomon makes these special sacrifices at Gibeon. This was the great high place. What made it different was that the tabernacle was there, even though the Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem. So back to the text again, if you please. Let's add 5 through 9. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, "Ask whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" This remarkable visitation from God happened in what is described as a dream. And this is one of the more significant dreams, I believe, that you will find in the Bible. It brings an amazing promise. As I read it, God seems to offer Solomon whatever he wants. And this wasn't only because Solomon sacrificed the 1,000 animals. It was because I believe at this point his heart was surrendered to God, and God wanted to work something in Solomon through this offer and through this response. Now, the natural reaction to reading this promise of God to Solomon would be to say, well, I wish we had a promise like that as well. I wish we had such a promise too. And I thought that, and then I immediately concluded, we do have that, don't we? We most certainly do. And before responding to God's offer and asking for anything, Solomon remembers God's faithfulness to both God and now also to himself. And he says, God, you have been so kind. You have been so good, both to my dad and to me. I am but a little child in your presence. We understand that Solomon at this point in his life was not really the age of a child, but he is coming before God in great humility, a humility I wished he could have held on to and would have maintained throughout his lifetime. He's coming before God in a special kind of humility, particularly as he considers the task, the job of being king that is in front of him. One writer says this statement is actually Solomon's poetic way of expressing his inadequacies as he faced the awesome task of the leadership of God's people. Solomon at this point in life, as he begins, didn't have a false humility that says, well, I can't do this, so I'm not even going to try. His attitude at this point was, God, this job is so much bigger than me. I have to rely on you. I need you. I need you to point me in the right direction. So Solomon asked for more than great knowledge. He wanted understanding, and he wanted it in his heart, not merely in his head. I did a bit of a word study on this, and it was actually very interesting to me that in the Hebrew word translated here in English, understanding, is a word literally that could also be translated just as well, hearing. Hearing. Solomon was asking God to give him a listening heart, a hearing heart, one that would listen to and heed the words of God. My, how his mind would change about that as he went through his life. And wouldn't we all do well to pray that same prayer for our own lives as well? God, give me a hearing heart. Give me a listening heart to whatever it is that you tell me. Solomon already understood that a key component of leadership is wise and just discernment. Now he wants the courage to get out there and use it. Back to the story, 10 through 15. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, so God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never be anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways, an oft repeated theme that is oft ignored, is oft forgotten. If you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke and realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all of his court. God was so pleased by what Solomon asked for, in that he knew his great need for wisdom and discernment and understanding. God was also very pleased by what Solomon did not ask for. He didn't ask for riches or fame or power for himself. He did not ask God to get even with all of his enemies. Solomon at this point did his job well or better than anyone. He made a good start. Yet as his falling away in the end will show, 1 Kings 11, there was still something lacking in his spiritual life. One commentator that I like to read, McLaren, writes this. There is no sign in his biography that he ever had the deep inward devotion to God that his father David had. And folks, I think that sums it up. I think that was the best statement I could find about the difference between David and Solomon. But God not only answers Solomon's prayer, he answers it beyond all expectation. Solomon did not ask for riches or honor or a long life. God was prepared to give him all of that as well. And folks, I hope we've all come to realize, or that we will, what we are, who we are, is so much more important than what we have. Well, Solomon wakes up. It was a dream, but at the same time, it was a very significant message from God. God answers his prayer, makes him wise, powerful, rich, and influential. His reign was glorious for Israel. Another commentator that I refer to from time to time, Adam Clarke, writes about Solomon being the wisest of men on the one hand, and Adam Clarke in his way says, and yet a man who demonstrated gross stupidity in his worship of idols on the other. And Clarke concludes his comments about Solomon by saying, no character in all of the sacred writing disappoints us more than the character of Solomon. Well, how about a demonstration of Solomon's great wisdom? You know the story, but let's read it again. Verses 16 to 22. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, no, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine. And so they argued before the king. Now, let's start with what, at least to me, is a remarkable testimony to the goodness and the generosity of King Solomon. I don't know that I've read of any other or many other or a single other king that would take the time to settle a matter of dispute between 2 prostitutes. And this really seems like an impossible problem to solve, doesn't it? Well, why would it be impossible? No witnesses, nobody else, just the word of one prostitute against another. And besides all of that, at least in my mind, who really cares? There is no independent witness to corroborate the testimony of either party, to witness the events. No one was in the house with them. Now 23 to 27. The king said, this one says my son is alive and your son's dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive. Then the king said, bring me a sword. Bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, cut the living child in 2 and give half to the one and half to the other. That's really going to solve the problem, isn't it? The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. But the other said, neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. Now, Solomon's solution to the problem at first, don't you know, looked pretty dangerous, pretty foolish to everybody in the court, to everyone involved. The wisdom of his approach was only understood when the matter was ultimately settled. And in the same way, the works and even the judgments of God that often seem so strange and dangerous and maybe even foolish to us at first, in time reveal the perfect knowledge and the perfect wisdom of God. The true parental relationship was proved by the love that was demonstrated. The true mother would rather have that child live without her than to die with her. That's what a mother does. She put that child's welfare far above her own. And Solomon knew that the offer to cut the child in 2 would reveal the true mother. And he rewarded that mother's love accordingly. Now the last verse of the chapter, verse 28. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. It was like everybody in Israel, when the word got out, it was sort of like everyone in Israel had that collective aha moment where all of them, all of Israel said, oh yeah, I get that now. I see it now. I see what he's doing. This king, our king, he is very, very wise. He has wisdom from God. The people of Israel saw that Solomon had both wisdom and the courage to do the right thing as a leader. If you backtrack in the text, this is exactly what David had talked to him about. Exactly. And this made the people hesitant to disobey the words of the law of the king. Now look at verses 20 to 21. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands on the seashore. Make you think about Abraham? Does me. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. There's something important I think needs to be mentioned just here. Solomon was not like David in that he did not have blood on his hands. He was not a warrior. He was not a soldier. He was not a general as his father was. But I think it needs to be noted that this peace that was achieved, that was now enjoyed by King Solomon, he really didn't have anything to do with it. His daddy did that. This was accomplished by David. So what I want you to do now is to move forward in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 11. We've talked about the beginning, and now we're headed to the other end, so to speak. Let's read now in 1 Kings chapter 11, the first 3 verses. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. In my mind, many is the understatement word of the text. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and he loved them all. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As I alluded to previously, one man, one male, 1,000 females. What could possibly go wrong with that? Anything that you could imagine. There are 2 obvious problems here. First, he loved foreign women who worshiped other gods and brought their pagan influences into Israel, and that is no small matter. Second, he loved many women, rejecting God's plan from the beginning that it should not be so. Now, God had warned Israel, warned and warned and warned, not to intermarry with these nations, because God knew it was very easy for him to see that these pagan influences would lead his people, turn their hearts, and change their minds to the service and the worship of foreign gods, and he was exactly right. So for all of Solomon's great wisdom, he did not have the common sense to apply what he had learned in his own life. Solomon likely did what many of us are inclined to do. He somehow in his mind thought he was above all of that, and that somehow he would be the exception. Somehow his heart wouldn't be turned away. Somehow he would not be involved in this sin, despite seeing how it affected everybody else. It won't affect me that way. He was wrong. Solomon will learn that as smart as he is not the exception to God's rule. And it is obvious that at this point in his life, Solomon desired romance and sensual pleasure and fulfillment more than he desired the direction of the Lord that he had asked for earlier in his days. You know, folks, he might have been the smartest guy in the room. Just gather anybody you want to gather together for whatever purpose. He's the smartest guy in the room. But when it came to the women, he was the weakest. He was absolutely the weakest. I keep coming back to that number, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and culturally for us, and the cultures being so different, that's a hard thing for us. It's almost an unbelievable number. 700 wives for whom he was responsible, 300 legal mistresses. He followed the bad example of his father David, who also had multiple wives and many concubines himself. Samuel talks about it in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And let me just add one more thing here for free, no extra charge for this. If one wife is not enough to satisfy a man, then I can promise you 1,000 wives will also not do the trick. It will not be enough. When a man is unsatisfied with the partner, with the woman God gave to him, the problem is him. It's not whether he's got one wife or two wives or 1,000. Even 1,000 women will not satisfy the lust of that man. Now, in those days, a large harem was a status symbol, so let's throw that in there. It said to the world, look how many wives I can support. Look how many children I can support. Look how many women I have direct authority over. There was lust and there was pride, and the two mixed together made for a very bad combination. And exactly what God had said would happen did. His wives led him astray. Of course they did. Now, we don't know when Solomon added his second wife. Historically, we don't know. Whenever he did, whenever he got to number 2 and then number 3, I think it's safe to say it was easy for him to rationalize adding more and more and more. And he added these wives, and he broke the specific command that God had given about marriage and about the kings of Israel doing this kind of thing. I'll give you a reference there, Deuteronomy 17:17. The end result was very bad. Now let's go back to the text we're in 1 Kings, and let's go ahead and add verses 4 through 8. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Now, we all believe that as you get older, you're supposed to get wiser, right? Age makes you wiser, should make you a little smarter. Age did not make Solomon wiser. He seemed to me, reading his story, to be wiser in the beginning, to be wiser in his youth, and old age seemed to just solidify these sinful tendencies that were now a part of his life every single day. Age and experience should make us more godly and more wise. But I think this story is proof that they do not automatically do so. Solomon is a contrast to those who did fully follow the Lord. And this same phrase is used in a positive sense of 3 men in the Old Testament: Joshua and Caleb in Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua and here of David. Solomon is identified conspicuously as someone who did not fully follow. He did not completely, who did not wholly follow the Lord. And there's a distinct difference between how Solomon's mind and his heart worked and how his father David's mind and heart worked. It was mentioned in our Wednesday night class, in our prep class. I think Dr. Lloyd mentioned this the other night. Never in Scripture do you find a lament from Solomon for his sin. You don't find the tender words that you find of David in the Psalms. Oh Lord, I've sinned against you, and wash me clean and create in me a pure heart. You don't see that. You don't hear that from Solomon. David spiritually survived this type of failing. Solomon did not. Did David sin? Absolutely. How could you read his life story and not believe that? But David's sin did not ultimately turn his heart away from the Lord. David's sin hurt him bad. It hindered him. Ultimately, it punished him in terrible ways. Solomon's sin ruined him. Solomon's sin just seems almost so unbelievable when you consider everything that was laid at his feet. a man of great heritage and wisdom and blessing and opportunity, turns to the most depraved gods of the pagan nations, and he builds temples for all of them on behalf of his wives. One commentator that I read believes in his own mind, Solomon probably did not see this as a denial of the God of Israel, but rather an adding of these other gods. And we know that he did it in large part for the benefit of his pagan wives, but then he concludes, and rightfully so, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It was not acceptable to God, whatever his reasons. God is a jealous God. Scripture is clear. He tolerates no rivals. And friends, this is a very vivid and stark example of the power of the lust of the flesh. Solomon never saw himself going down that road to ruin. He never saw himself winding up where he did. I guess if this was the case with a man who is identified as the wisest man who ever lived, then what hope do we have apart from our constant dependence upon and listening to the Word of God? It's back to that prayer. God, give me a listening heart. Give me a hearing heart. Let the example of what happened to Solomon as he didn't listen and he did not hear speak loud and clear to your own life. So now the true God is about to announce judgment. Back to your text, 9 through 13. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless," and I think this is so interesting, "for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." God had a very special reason to be displeased with Solomon, and he reminds him, "I have appeared to you not only once, but twice, and you still turned your heart after these other gods." Solomon's sin was the sin of base ingratitude and a waste of great spiritual privilege. You know, folks, sometimes we think that great spiritual experiences will keep us away from sin and keep us faithful to God. God promised the entire kingdom of Israel to the descendants of David forever. Think about how long forever is if they only remained obedient. And they couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. David had reminded Solomon of this promise shortly before his death. David reminded him of it, 1 Kings chapter 2. The sad story is they couldn't remain faithful even for one single generation. Solomon's kingdom was an outstanding example, the world example of wealth and privilege and military might and prestige. And with all of that, they didn't understand that the true security of Israel did not rest in any of those things. It rested in the faithfulness of a God who said to them, "If you'll just follow me, if you'll just listen to me, if you'll just obey me, I'll be faithful to you forever." That's where their security rested, and that's where mine lies. And so is it where your lies as well. For the sake of David, God delayed his judgment on Solomon until after Solomon's generation, but he brought it on the very next one. And even in this great judgment, God mingles undeserved mercy with deserved judgment. God announces that the kingdom's going to be divided, and part of it will be loyal to the descendants of David, and part of it will be under a different dynasty. The southern kingdom was made up of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern would be all the rest. So we're back to the text, and we start reading at 14 through 22. The Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking men from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. And while he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his fathers, and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go that I may return to my own country." Solomon's reign was indeed glorious, but boy, as he got toward the end, it was not without lots of problems. God raised up adversaries like Hadad against Solomon. You think about all the reasons Hadad had to seek vengeance for his conquered people. And he found refuge and support in Egypt, and now he's got the opportunity to cause a lot of problem. The text does not tell us specifically how Hadad troubled or became a great adversary to Solomon, but it tells us that he certainly did. And if you move on down through the text, and I won't read all of that to you and all of those names, God raised up lots of other adversaries as well against Solomon, and you read about them in this chapter. He allowed them to bring trouble to the kingdom. Now let's add 29 through 36. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's fathers, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose and who observed my commands and statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name." In this acted out prophecy, Ahijah shows Jeroboam that he would lead 10 tribes of a divided Israel after the death of Solomon. God promised to divide Israel and put 10 of the 12 tribes under Jeroboam as judgment for the sin and the idolatry of Solomon. God would still keep 1 tribe under the house of David, Judah, with Benjamin having been swallowed up in Judah, in faithfulness to his promise, this is important, to his servant David, to David. So folks, this is the first you hear of the divided kingdom, which will become Israel's history for hundreds of years after the death of Solomon. And at this first description, we would expect that the 10 tribes under Jeroboam would be larger and greater and more enduring than the one left to the house of David. As it worked out, just the opposite happened because the 10 tribes forsook the Lord, while the 1 tribe was more obedient. Now go back to the text. Let's read 37 to 40. "However, as for you, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel." Here it is again. "If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever." And Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt to Shishak the king and stayed there until Solomon's death. God ordained the division of Israel. The reign of Jeroboam that we're about to study, he did this as great judgment upon Solomon and his actions. And it's so interesting. God promises to make for Jeroboam a lasting dynasty. If what? If you'll just do what is right in my sight. I think there are some parallels here. Both Jeroboam and David were appointed by God to come to power following disobedient kings who had served before them. David waited upon the Lord to make the path clear for him to the throne, and God blessed his reign as a result. Jeroboam, you will find, did not wait upon the Lord and decided to make his own path to the throne, and God did not bless his reign. And we even read that Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. So, the rest of the chapter, 41 to 43. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. I just can't help but come back to that statement. If you will walk in my ways, if you will obey my statutes and my commands as David your father did, I'll do this and this and this, and I'll give you a long life. If you do the math, and I encourage you to do it in your own personal reading, Solomon didn't get that long life. He didn't live to be an old man. The final look at the life of Solomon really leads you to believe that he died in apostasy. I wish there was a cheerful ending that I could give you to this story. I don't have one. I can't judge him, and I won't try. I can tell you that God showed very special mercy to Solomon because of and for the benefit of and on behalf of his father David. And I am sure that God has always called and will continue and does even now call his people to walk in his ways, to listen to with a hearing heart and obey his commands, and by doing so, to honor his ways. Now, any and all questions that you may have from this point forward about the two kingdoms, about a divided kingdom, as the next chapter will entitle it, about a kingdom torn in two, those will be answered perfectly and clearly by Dr. Lloyd beginning next Sunday morning. I appreciate you being in class. I know it was a lot of material for us to cover. I wish we could have covered more. And I hope you'll do that in your own personal reading and study this week. Thank you for being in our class this morning.